Good morning and welcome. I'm Bill Frenzel, a co-chairman of the Bretton Woods Committee, and it's my happy task today to give you the official welcome. We are really honored to have such a room full of luminaries, including our distinguished speakers, diplomats, prominent global citizens of all kinds, members of the academia and nonprofit sector. We appreciate your presence. We hope you will find it. You will have a profitable day with us. There may be some of you who are not familiar with the Bretton Woods Committee. It's been around for 30 years. We hope it'll be around in the future. It's a nonpartisan network of prominent global citizens which works to demonstrate the value of international economic cooperation and to foster strong, effective Bretton Woods institutions as forces for global well-being. We are unaffiliated. We live off of our members. We are relatively poorly financed, but we struggle along, doing the best we can to promote these Bretton Woods institutions and to promote improvements in those institutions. Our strength lies in you. We offer constructive criticism to the IFIs themselves, and we try to convince members of the two world's greatest deliberative bodies in town of the need for proper quotas and reform ideas. But it's tough sledding. We often find ourselves very much alone, and we appreciate our own members' help in helping with these programs. For instance, this year we were vigorously engaged in gaining signatures of former cabinet officers for the IMF. That unfortunately, as Senator McCain indicated, that effort fell short. We hope it can be revived. At the same time, we are conducting training sessions in both the House and the Senate for members of the significant committee staff people so that they will understand, be able to ask questions of bank employees and fund employees and of outsiders as to the advantages of these IFIs. We've had some success with that program this year. Now we are in a period of big change in our global arrangements, and we are hopeful that the committee is going to continue its leadership in assessing these changes and reacting to them. For this reason, we have titled today's program, Multilateralism in the Age of Austerity. We thought that was a good theme for the year, and our speakers have graciously agreed to follow that with us. And so we're going to be working on that all day. The age of austerity and relatively high unemployment has been difficult for all of the countries of the world, and we hope that we'll get some ideas about how we might move forward today. I do have a few housekeeping notes for you before we begin. First of all, thanks to our distinguished speakers and our moderators for performing for us, and thanks to all of you attendees for being here. Second, thanks to President Kim and to the World Bank for its support in making these facilities available to us, and for their generally gracious hospitality. Finally, to the Bretton Woods staff, a very slim group, and particularly to Office Manager Susan Nitsch, thanks for putting this program together today. Some more announcements. Put your cell phones on silent if they aren't already. We probably will not have structured breaks this morning. So facilities are outside, coffee is outside as you need to use them, because our program will move as swiftly as our speakers are able to arrive here. We have a question period after each of these panels, and there are the microphones which you can see around the room. We ask that your questions be short and that each of your statements be followed by a question mark. First, give your name and your affiliation, and we'd like to be tough about holding those questions down to a terse telegraphic sort of style. Next, you are seated at tables for the reason that we are going to be eating in this room around noon. There will be an announcement when the last panel breaks before lunch, and you will go out into the hall and procure food and bring it back to the seat that you now occupy and eat there. In the meantime, the staff, we hope, will have refreshed the water bottles and so forth, so we hope it is not inconvenient for you. 2 rooms would have been better, but they simply were not available, and so we're doing the best with what we have. Now, a last-minute announcement. When one signs an indenture to the Bretton Woods Committee, it seems to be perpetual. But eventually, the passing of time exerts its own term limits pressures on everybody, including myself. And today I am going to be stepping down as co-chairman of the Bretton Woods Committee, and that's phase 1 of the good news. Phase 2 is that my job will be taken over, and in fact has already been taken over, by Congressman Jim Colby, who you saw up here on the stage, who is well known to all of you. Congressman Colby chaired the Committee of Appropriations in the House that funded international operations, is conversant with all of the banks and the funds, and is absolutely taken to the ground running. He's been running for 1.5 years, doing my job as it is. And so as I step backward, Jim steps forward, and I do it with great regret, and I thank all of you who have worked with and for the Bretton Woods Committee. It is a noble cause, and it has to be completed. Now, I see Jim working in the background, and I fear he's going to pour holy water on my remains, and I beg him to be brief.
Thank you, Bill. Don't leave the stage. It's something like holy water, for sure, Bill. Well, when Bill asked if I would consider taking on some of this responsibility at Bretton Woods, it was hard to say no to somebody who I consider to be my real mentor in the Congress. I think that everything I ever learned about trade in Congress came from following in the footsteps of Bill Frenzel, and so he was a great teacher, a great mentor, and somebody it was a great privilege to follow. The very fact that we are here today, the very fact that the Bretton Woods Committee is what it is today, is in very large measure due to the leadership, the tireless leadership, continuing leadership that Bill Frenzel has shown over the years. And we are so grateful that he has given us that tireless leadership, that he has given us that consistent leadership, because it has been absolutely essential to keeping this organization going. Any of you that have been at meetings with Bill Frenzel know that any time a notepad is put down in front of him, he immediately starts a doodle. I'm sure all of us have seen one or more of his elaborate doodles. I have one of them framed and in my office in Arizona. So I think today we have a little something that we're going to present that has to do with that, and I think we're going to have a couple of other people join us up here. And by the way, if you haven't had a chance, you need to come up and look at these at a break time and see them. Here, let me get out of the way here. Here's 4 of them. I'm happy to say it's all on Bretton Woods notepads here. So this gives some indication, Bill, of the number of years you've been doodling at Bretton Woods here. In addition, I'm sure, to taking very extensive notes on the side while you're doing this. And here we have what truly is one of the more elaborate ones here, which is a really very, very special one. It's even have some color to it. Normally it's just in blue, but it has some color. With that, let me turn this over to Dick here, or Bill.
Let's get a picture here.
We want to get a picture with you here. Let's get up here.
Okay.
Somehow you should get up and take a look at those doodles. They're incredible. I've always had great pleasure in sitting near Bill just to watch the artist at work. And he is very much engrossed in what he's doing. It's amazing. He's sort of obsessed with it. And Jim made a little mistake in saying that he thinks he also takes notes at the same time. Bill does not take notes at the same time. All he's concerned with is getting that doodle down. And I often wondered, if he's listening to anything that's being said. However, as soon as his time comes to speak, up he jumps, full of energy, ready, on the button, carrying on as if he were right up on the podium all the way through, knowing it all. He's obviously energized by his artwork, and it really is terrific. You have to take a look. It's incredible. And when you see it being done, it's even more incredible. At any rate, I won't carry on about Bill except to say he's a great team worker and a leader and a friend. And Jim Colby has very large shoes to fill. We know he will be doing it very, very well indeed. And I might say that not only Bill, but Jim Wolfenson, who unfortunately couldn't be with us today, and I are very, very pleased that Jim has agreed to take on this position that has been so well filled over the years by Bill. Now, speaking of teams, I'm also very pleased to announce formally, most of you may know about it, especially if you looked in the brochure, about the creation of an advisory council to the Bretton Woods Committee. The details are all in the program, the concept, the benefits, the evolution, how we got there, why we think it's a good idea. Time passes, and time makes it clear that this is what we need in the evolution of the work of this committee. The real issue, the basic issue, is the stature of the individuals who would serve in such a capacity and enhance the work and the mission of the not only the Bretton Woods Committee, but the Bretton Woods institutions. And I'm happy to report that our efforts in that respect have been, in my opinion, in all of our opinions, very successful and very proud of what I would call a dream team of 5 distinguished, experienced, prominent, diverse, and dedicated individuals. Their names, as you know, are in the brochure, and I won't go through an introduction of any of them because they are all so well known to anyone who has anything to do with the Bretton Woods system. They are Jean-Claude Trichet, Ruth Peratt, Sir David Walker, and Mohamed El-Erian and Bill Rhodes. And Mohamed and Bill are here with us today and are going to be on the program. And I'd ask you to stand up a bit and take an applause on behalf of the whole advisory committee. We're very, very proud to have you and the committee, the council, I should say. It's not a committee. And so that's a good introduction to our next panel, which you will see. And both Bill and Mohamed, together with Luis Alberto Moreno, who is here with us. Alberto, if you're all ready and you join me up here, we'll continue with the next panel. I should say we'll have brief remarks by all of our panelists, and then a discussion period. Alberto? Yeah. And the order will be Alberto. Where do you want it? Yeah. And Mohamed and Bill. Good. Without any lavish introductions, we have here 3 individuals who will be commenting on the mission, the work of the Bretton Woods institutions from the view and about the view of the private sector, and well qualified in all respects, as you know. Alberto has been a leader on the development issues in the public sector, a splendid career at the Inter-American Development Bank, and an expert on that particular area. Mohamed has been in both. He's been in the IMF for many years, a distinguished leader there, and has been in the private sector and has much experience across the board. And Bill, as a longtime banker on the international side, has probably been the single most important liaison between the private sector, the banking sector, and the Bretton Woods institutions and all of the IFIs. He's had a great career leading in times of crisis, for example, the Latin American debt crisis and so forth. So with that all, and we'll follow the rules as announced by Bill about microphones. They're here. We'll have a few minutes of each opening remarks, then some discussions on the platform, and then questions from the audience. And I'm sure we'll be well rewarded for being here. Alberto, if you please.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Richard, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and certainly a pleasure to be here with Mohamed El-Erian, who has tremendous experience in dealing with Latin American issues, and more importantly, of course, with Bill Rhodes, which I guess the good thing about it is that Bill Rhodes no longer is employed in Latin America, and the crises that he had to deal with are in other parts of the world. So I'm very happy that we're in a different moment in that regard. But he was, as you all know, instrumental in dealing with what were probably in the space of 25 years, over 30 financial crises in Latin America. But let me just start, because the question here that Richard was posing is about, you know, the role of the private sector in development, which is every day more a conversation that we all are having in all development institutions. And I know that many of you have been following the great French luminary Thomas Piketty, who I'm sure everybody's read this very deep and very serious book. But I'm going to really talk about a real star, and that is Sean Penn. And you'd be surprised I'd be talking about Sean Penn, but it just so happens that we've been doing a lot of work in Haiti. And part of that work in Haiti, we did an investor conference soon after the earthquake that took place in Haiti. And at the time, even much to the surprise of Sean Penn, we put him in an infrastructure panel. And as we entered this discussion in this infrastructure panel, many people started asking him, you know, what were the best things to do and how could others really help Haiti and how could they help NGOs. And his answer was one that really, I think, captures the idea here. And what he said then is, if you really want to help Haiti, don't give me money as an NGO. Come down and invest in Haiti. And the reason, of course, is that the real challenge there is jobs. And jobs really are generated in the private sector. And the whole discussion around private sector investment became, as a result, a very important one, and one that we have been leading. And as a result, we're able to get some anchor investors to begin to do agricultural production. So this is really a challenge not only for Haiti, but for any emerging market. The reality is, if you look at today in Latin America, despite the many advances that we've had over the past few years, we still have huge challenges. Challenges that are related, for instance, in terms of the need to increase our investment rates. If you look at Asia, for instance, Asia has been with investment rates that are over 25%. Latin America, in the best year, has been no more than 23%. We definitely need to increase, of course, side to side with that, our investment rate, and that's probably one of the biggest challenges we have, because if those two don't go together, it's hardly a possibility to address the many difficult competitive issues that we have today. For instance, infrastructure is something that is talked about today in the G20 in a very big way. There's a lot of thinking about how best to do infrastructure investment. As we look closely at what happened certainly in Latin America, was that the adjustment factor during the many years of the crises was to drop the investments in infrastructure to the rate of which they are today, close to 2% of GDP. If we are to remain competitive, they need to, at a minimum, double. And this not only requires very strong capabilities inside governments for true project managers, but it requires a combination of instruments in development in local currency, in being able to have, remove a lot of the risks and public-private partnerships. And these are the kinds of things development institutions are ideally suited for. Equally, the big discussion on technology, we are still lagging tremendously in Latin America in investments in technology. In fact, the average country probably is investing close to not even 1% of GDP, and compare that to countries like Israel, which is closer to 5%, or countries like South Korea, which is closer to 4%. And then when you look at closer at the issues of productivity, again, you find that Latin American firms, only 1% of them have been really able to move up the productivity dial and compare, let's say, to productivity levels of US companies. The other is the lack of adequate financing for the SME sector, and this is not unique to Latin America, of course, but there's a huge gap there. In fact, we estimate that credit gap is close to $155 billion. And the other part, of course, is we're not as linked today as we should be, despite the fact that we have all these trade agreements that have been put in place. We're not as linked to the world economy as we should be. In fact, about 87% of Latin American companies have never had a foreign investor. Of course, I must say here that 70% or more of Latin American companies are small and medium enterprises. So again, this is a need for development finance as well. And finally, the whole question of skills. We are seeing more and more a tremendous challenge in skills gaps in Latin America, to the point that many countries are embracing immigration in ways that we have never seen before. And of course, the first flows of that immigration have come from Europe, either from countries like Portugal or Spain, but they're growing. And these are all signals of the kinds of gaps that we have that we must begin to fill. So we at the IDB have been, of course, working across all of these areas, which in some, they are addressed at finding ways to increase productivity in Latin America, and certainly helping the private sector as we go. We've focused on underserved segments such as microenterprises, underfunded sectors as well, and for financial services and in infrastructure. And we haven't done as good a job, for instance, on the base of the pyramid, which is a much more difficult challenge. We are in the process right now of doing a major restructuring. I mean, of course, this is what happens in Washington institutions, so we're not unlike the World Bank. We're doing a major restructuring around the integration of all our private sector windows. So as a group, we can basically do a better job in dealing with some of the private sector challenges. I believe that going forward, and especially in a region like Latin America and the Caribbean, the private sector increasingly will be more important. So anyways, I would just perhaps stop there, and thank you all for inviting me to this. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Alberto. Thank you. Mohamed?
So first, let me say what a great honor it is to be here, and what a great pleasure it is to reconnect with so many friends and acquaintances, and how privileged I feel that I can serve on the Advisory Council. What I'd like to do is complement what you just heard and what I think you're going to hear by making 5 simple points that I've chosen from an incredibly interesting world. And we are living in the midst of enormous global fluidity. If you believe in distribution of outcomes, which I do, if you are honest about your expected distribution of outcomes, it would not look like what we are used to in our normal lives, which is a very well-behaved bell-shaped distribution, which has a very high expected outcome. If you come here, this will take place. It has thin tails. It could have been canceled. You could have gotten lots of prizes coming in, but you don't plan on the tails. You plan on the expected outcome. We no longer living in a world like this. We're living in a world where the middle of the distribution has come down, and the 2 risks, something really good happening or something really bad happening, has increased. And what I'd like to do is focus my 5 points on why it is we're here and what it looks like. And I'm going to be very brief. The first point I would make is that if you look at a distribution like this, and if you ask an economist what is foremost to making sure that good outcomes have a higher probability, that economist would tell you, he or she would tell you, that a couple of things are probably part of the solution. Greater awareness and greater cooperation among the main players. And if you put this in a global context, it translates into the following hypothesis, which I think is more than a hypothesis. I think is a fact. But I will call it a hypothesis here because some of you may disagree, that at a time when we need multilateralism the most, at a time when we need mutual understanding, a common vision, and policy cooperation, we have the least of it. In fact, to use Ian Bremmer's terms, we've gone from a world of Gs, and you can pick G7, G20, G1, G8, to a world of G0. That is the journey we're on. We're not quite at a G0 world, but we're heading that way. And if you cannot fill that vacuum through multilateralism, then the world is in trouble. The second point I'm going to make is the reason for that goes from the understandable and regrettable to the really, really regrettable. Among the really, really regrettable, you heard Senator John McCain this morning. It is almost impossible to explain to someone outside the United States how the US did not support the IMF reforms. They were modest. They didn't cost the US anything in terms of incremental money. They didn't cost anything to the US in terms of loss of voice and representation. And the US relies on multilateral institutions for outcomes that are in its national interest. So when you go outside the US, it's impossible to explain rationally why it is that Congress did what it did. And yet it did. On the understandable but regrettable, it is true that we have emerged from the global financial crisis with very high level of persistent unemployment, especially among the young in the West, that the talk of secular stagnation is something that has to be taken seriously. And we have a tremendous level of inequality in there, all of which makes countries much more inwardly looking. Which leads me to the third point, is the opportunities that are being foregone are huge, absolutely huge. Every time we grow at a global economy at 1% less, we solidify problems that are going to be very hard to solve. If you have kids, worry about youth unemployment. I do. I have an 11-year-old, and I worry about that. Worry about long-term unemployment. Worry about income inequality. These are problems that are very difficult to reverse once they've become entrenched in the system. And once they become entrenched in the system, not only are they difficult to reverse, they involve a lot of collateral damage. Which leads me to my fourth point. If you look at the four big risks that are facing the global economy today, and I've narrowed down to four, each of them gets worse as we continue in this low equilibrium growth rates. And each of them shifts the tails from good outcomes to bad outcomes. The first one is geopolitics. A migration towards the G0 world is a migration towards deglobalization, nationalism, and regionalism. That is what this migration encourages. Vacuums get filled, and a vacuum at the multilateral level gets filled. So geopolitical issues become not just geopolitical, but they have economic and financial consequences. And you need only look at what happens if the world fails to de-escalate the tensions in Ukraine. If the world fails to de-escalate the tensions, then you will end up with lose, 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 lose. Ukraine will go into a massive contraction that's even more than the 7% that's been forecasted. Russia will go into a major recession with high inflation and with financial instability, and that's the 7th largest economy in the world. Most likely, you will get sanctions at the sector level and counter-sanctions at the energy level. Europe goes into recession, and the US gets impacted badly. And that is just one of the geopolitical pressures there. The second risk, and it's something that Bill will talk about, is you have some major systemically important developing countries trying to shift growth models. Brazil, India, and of course China are three examples of countries trying to shift growth models. Trying to shift a growth model is difficult enough based on domestic issues. It becomes even more difficult when the global economy is so complicated. And when you have massive flows of capital going in and out that make you focus on the immediate and urgent and not the immediate and important, and less so on the important but not so immediate, which is changing the growth model. So navigating those transitions among really big economies, there are examples of it being done among small economies, but these are really large economies that are trying to change their growth drivers, is really important for everybody. And yet, complications at the multilateral level make that challenge even more. The third issue is how do we exit, or how do we understand the consequences of the amazing monetary policy experimentation that has been going on in the West. It was necessary because if the Fed and if the ECB and if the Bank of England and if the Bank of Japan hadn't stepped in, the alternative would have been worse. But it was only meant to be a short-term bridge. And again, Senator McCain didn't give us much encouragement that the politicians will step up to their responsibilities. And why is that important? Is because they control agencies that have much better tools to deal with debt overhangs, to deal with structural impediments, and to deal with an unbalanced demand management. So we don't quite know how it is that we will deal with the consequences of having relied for so long on experimental monetary policy. Which leads to the fourth risk. The markets is forgetting a lot of the lessons it learned after 2007 and 2008. The amount of risk-taking that has come back into the markets, because after all, if the Fed and the central banks are always there, why not take risk? Why not lever every risk factor you can find, be it credit, liquidity, volatility? So the vacuum at the multilateral level leads to these risks that are on a standalone basis problematic, but put all four of them together, then you have this fat left tail. Which leads me to my final point, is we have also a very big right tail. And it's one that we don't talk enough about. And it's one that, now that I have a broader range of interest, I am amazed by the potential out there. It comes from technological innovation. And what is really impressive is to see the extent to which certain communities within emerging economies are able to leapfrog technologically because of the combination of mobility, the internet, and social media. Those three things are enabling an enormous amount of leapfrogging, from payments and settlement systems that work much better, to peer-to-peer lending, to information that a farmer needs to get the right application of pesticides and fertilizers at the right time. So there's a tremendous ability, things going on at the micro level. There's also, as we heard this morning, significant cash on the side. And in response to the question about public-private partnership, if we can do all the little things that can unleash that, including a greater willingness to fail. The problem with public-private partnership is that we don't celebrate the successes, and the minute there's one failure, which there will be a failure, the minute there's one failure, it becomes totally overwhelming. The result of which, any risk-neutral person doesn't get involved in them, whether in the private sector or the public sector. You're under-involved in these things because the asymmetry is there. Which leads me to my final point is none of this happens, you don't exploit the right tail without a change in mindset. Without understanding that we are going through this fluidity, without understanding that changes in institutional representation, in voice, are in the interest of everybody. It is much better to have a smaller voice in a successful enterprise than stay in a big voice with a very challenged enterprise. Thank you very much.
Very good.
Bill?
First of all, I would like to say it's a great pleasure to be on the same platform with Luis Alberto Moreno, an old friend, Mohamed El-Erian, an old friend, and with you, Dick Debs. We go back so far. Also, the honor that you've given me to be on this advisory council with Mohamed and others. Picking up, I guess, a little bit on what's been said, I've been asked to talk about China and Japan, but before I do it, I'd like to say something about the general world economy, trade, and a subject that's bothering me a lot that I see coming up is a tendency towards protectionism. I think the optimistic signals on growth that we're seeing for the world put out by many, they think they're not optimistic, but I think what I see they are. When you just go around the world very rapidly, I think here in the United States, I think that getting to 3%, which is Janet Yellen and the Fed's target, is not going to be easy, given all the factors we know. I think the whole question of tapering interest rates already. We're starting to see some new thoughts on the table. Bill Duddy gave a speech yesterday about that. The uncertainty that this causes, not only here domestically, but very much in the emerging markets, as we've seen over the last few years. The lack of coordination, because as we're starting to rev back some, the ECB is obviously going to have to do the opposite, and Japan's going to continue to do what they're doing. And the question of China, it's not all that clear. When you pass over to the Eurozone, I think all the optimism we've seen in the markets, and sometimes the markets are wrong, we've seen that a number of times, about the optimism of Europe being over, the Eurozone being over their debt crisis and moving on, I don't think is really demonstrated by reality. When you look at the tremendous unemployment rates in the Eurozone, ex-Germany, when you take a look at the figures of inflation, and I think the European Central Bank has moved too slowly on this. Mario Draghi says that he's going to be moving in a couple of weeks at the June meeting, but this may be too late to really impact the situation. So other than Germany, I see the Eurozone very strong in the area of stagnation, which is not good for the world. I think that when you take a look at some of the emerging markets, and I think we'll have questions, the three of us, four of us on this. I won't get into specifics. Luis Alberto has commented on Latin America, and Mohamed has mentioned this new paradigm of the change we're seeing in China, which I'll comment on. Obviously, the changes that Modi is going to be implementing in India, some of the problems that we're seeing in Brazil. I think the emerging markets are going to be very, very tested going forward. To comment specifically, which is what I was, and if we take a look, before I get on to China, if we take a look at some of the trade figures, they really kind of show the problem of world growth. In 2007, the last year we have before the Great Recession, trade grew at slightly over 13%. The last 2 years we've seen around 2%. Now, optimists say this year it should rev up to 4.7%. We'll see, not really clear. And when we have these European elections coming up, for the Parliament, European Parliament, I think you're going to get a lot of protectionist sentiment, which will be going forth if the radical parties on the left and right do as well as prescribed. I think you see tendencies of that already coming up in a number of the emerging markets, and also specifically in countries that I'm going to be talking about, China and Japan. So my concern is that we may see a rise of protectionism, and I've done a number of pieces on that. People think I'm too pessimistic, but I think it's a real, clear and present danger, frankly. Talking specifically about China, as we know, China is going through the greatest change we've seen in over a quarter century. Really the greatest change since the days of Deng Xiaoping, and his famous speech in Shenzhen in 1992 about the color of the cat, as long as it could catch mice, etc., and even going further back, where you had this tremendous investment in industry, heavy investment for export, and the whole economy was built around that. Now, finally, China, after announcing it in several five-year plans beforehand, is really moving towards a model of domestic consumption. And we saw the results of the third plenum that occurred in November that talked about a number of major changes that, frankly, most of us China watchers, and there are a number here in the audience, and frankly in China itself, have been waiting for. On the economic side, I think we're going to see some major changes in the financial system. You're going to see freeing up of interest rates. We've started to see that. Deposit insurance. All of these geared to get consumers, frankly, to spend more and save less, which is what you need for a consumer-driven economy. I am also more optimistic on when we're going to see convertibility of the RMB than most people are. And I think, as you're aware, a laboratory for a lot of these changes being set up in Shanghai, which will be followed by other free trade zones in the country. I think all of that is very positive. I think we see a strong leadership. Many people, including myself, see Xi Jinping as the strongest leader China's had since Deng Xiaoping, and he will need to be to carry forth these reforms. At the same time that you talk about these reforms, and I should say that this doesn't come cost-free. As Mohamed said, when you make these changes, it impacts economic growth, even if they're for the positive, medium, and long term. And so I think China is going to struggle to get 7% growth. The target is 7.5%. I think the 7% growth figure is not going to be easy. I learned from Zhu Rongji many, many years ago, and I think he's probably the author of the 7% because he said, you know, Bill, you need that type of growth in China to absorb the jobs coming in from Western China to the coast without the need for social, measures, other social measures that might be needed to prevent instability. So I think it is a major challenge to implement the reforms of the third plenum. I think they're right on. I think you have the team to do it. But there's some problems in China, in addition to the ones I mentioned. Those of you who have long memories remember it was 14 years ago that the People's Bank of China had to step in and recapitalize the Chinese banking system, the formation of asset management companies to take off the bad debt. Through this tremendous stimulus of 2008, 2009, we saw tremendous lending to municipalities, provinces, and state-owned enterprises. And a lot of these loans are having to be rolled over. So one of the questions that you have today is, where goes the financial system in China? The banks obviously are going to have to be recapitalized in the sense of I think, raising a lot of capital per se. But during this period, the last 5 to 7 years, you had the rise of a tremendous amount of shadow banking. The major banks formed trust companies, and others got into that end of it. And this business has not been highly regulated like the CBRC regulates the banking system. And some people estimate, it's really not known, that this shadow banking system may be anywhere from 10 to 20, some even say 30% of the total financial system. And so I think this poses a danger for China, where they're going through this tremendous reform process to make sure that they are able to properly regulate, have the necessary capital standards, that you don't have a problem that came up 14 years ago, because 14 years ago, China didn't have the size economy they have today. The world's second largest, and some people think by the end of the year and next year, it'll be the world's largest economy. So the world depends very much, not just on the United States, Europe, et cetera, but on the U.S., on China, as well as the U.S. and Europe and the other major emerging market economies. In addition to these challenges, China also has the challenge of corruption, the challenge of pollution. And so I think this is really a major work that's in progress in China. And we've got to all hope that the leadership can bring this off successfully, because that's very important for world growth going forward. Very briefly, and if I have 2 minutes, Dick, just to say, in Japan, we have a very interesting experiment with Abenomics. 3 hours, fiscal monetary stimulus, which we've seen plenty of. But the third arrow is going to make or break Abenomics, which is structural reform and deregulation. And unfortunately, we haven't seen enough of that. And if this program is to be successful over time, you must see more structural reform in the economy and deregulation. And there's some steps that are being taken, but they need to be taken more rapidly, because it's very important to have the world's third largest economy in good shape. And that's not even to get into the problems that exist today on the strategic side between China and Japan. I would just say that we're living in a very uncertain world. I think this is a time that we look to the international financial institutions. Many times for guidance, the IMF, World Bank, and regional development banks, and very much the G20. I'm very concerned that this G20 meeting of heads of state in Australia that'll take place in the fall will not be what it should be, because we already have the problem that was discussed very well by Mohamed of what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. And obviously Russia is very, very important to that G20 process. And it'll be very interesting to see also where China is going to come out in this. So I think with the problems that could be coming up in the area of protectionism, the slower growth that we see in many parts of the world, I think it's very important that we see a meaningful G20 meeting. And I would put to you that we haven't seen a meaningful G20 meeting since the meetings in London at the height of the Great Recession. So I would say that we have a lot facing us up. And since we're sitting here in the World Bank, I think any efforts to strengthen the role of the World Bank and the IMF and regional development banks need to be taken in this uncertain world that we're dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Well, very, very piercing analysis. Very interesting points brought up. Very deep analysis. It isn't what I call a cheerleading team this morning, but very realistic, I'm afraid. I'd like to ask an institutional question about the system, the Bretton Woods system, and the IFIs, including the Inter-American Development Bank and so forth, on the public sector. Just taking a perspective on where we stand on that, vis-a-vis our principal topic, that is the private sector and the institutions themselves. I remember going back some years, in the mid-'80s, I think, we had a big conference in Acapulco, which was very nice. But everybody was assembled there talking about this subject, the role of the private sector vis-a-vis the, I don't know what they were called then, multilateral institutions and so forth. And nothing much was done after that. At that point, there had been really a wall. And what you're describing today, Luis Alberto, is the progress that's been made in that area. And I guess one of my questions is there more that can be done across the whole system, Bretton Woods, the World Bank, IMF, and so forth? And a related question, which comes up and is reflected in the discussion we had right now. Going back in time, there was not much coordination on a global basis between financial systems. Very, very, very limited. Very limited measures of cooperation between central banks or ministries of finance. And this does go back right into the 70s and 80s. And the Bretton Woods institutions didn't do much about it. Any cooperation, and it did develop over the years slowly. We had the Basel Committee formed and so forth. And all during that period, really, you would think the IMF would be a leader in that respect. But it was always behind the curve. So you had the financial systems growing from what I'd call pretty clear isolation into much closer, not very close, much closer cooperation today. The question there is, to all of you, where do you see that progress going? And is there more of a role for the Bretton Woods institutions, the multilateral institutions? Is that something, will that be, will that cause a change in the way things are happening? I'm reminded indeed of the speech we're going to hear this afternoon from Paul Volcker, if I may quote the title, "Time for a New Bretton Woods, ? And where will that go No laughter, please, no laughter. Where will that, how does this fit in with this idea of the progress, the evolution of these institutions, vis-a-vis the private sector, and in particular vis-a-vis the global financial system?